Thank you, Darlene, for the vulnerability in sharing that. Not sure where you're sitting out here. And yeah, there we go, right here. And thank you guys, truly, as Jeff said, as a church family, what we're doing is we're trying to create a culture of safety and vulnerability where people can share stories like this and be met with acceptance and pointed to Jesus. And we claim our hope in him, believing fully that one day all things are going to be made new, and we cannot wait. But until that day comes, we struggle with frailties and vulnerabilities, even in our body, and we carry around the death of Jesus and the struggle of this broken world. And it's hard at times. It's very, very hard. But we have hope, and we're so grateful. And we are in this series called The Journey. It's about overcoming apathy, anger, depression, and anxiety. And today, to me at least, is a colossal moment where we are talking about depression. I've never heard a sermon specifically on depression, and there's so much to say about it. I feel like we're really content heavy today, and if you just try to absorb everything, you might actually walk away with nothing. So tune in to some key parts and really try to jot down some notes and take some things home to mull over and think on, because this is a very complicated topic. It's a very sensitive topic. And what the goal is today is not necessarily to say, here's all the things you can do to work on healing from depression. It's more to say, let's create a culture of vulnerability and acceptance, this atmosphere of trust where we become a church that is safe, where we can bring these types of issues to the forefront, and we can talk about how Jesus meets us in the midst of our struggle. And so that's our goal. I'm going to go ahead and pray, and we're going to dive right in. And join me in prayer. Jesus, you are so good. You are the good shepherd, the keeper of our souls, the tender of our spirits, the father of our physical existence. We are alive because you allow us to take every single breath. And we struggle to understand your goodness in the midst of enormous suffering at times, and yet we look to your word that you've preserved throughout history, and we see that this is a very normal reality to feel both pain and pleasure, and we commit ourselves to following you and trusting you and knowing you more in and through everything that you give to us and bring to us. So open our eyes, give us discernment and wisdom and great measures of faith to face the complex reality that is depression, and give us hope. More than anything, give us hope from your word. May the power of your spoken and written words that have the ability to change and shape our lives be made known today. Amen. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some assumptions people make about depression. At least in my experience, I've studied as a marriage and family therapist, and so I have talked to a lot of people and heard a lot of kind of case studies, if you will, and have heard a lot of assumptions about depression that aren't always helpful. And then we're going to be talking about some ways that we can work together to overcome this horrid thing called depression. And remember from 3 weeks ago, when we say overcome, we don't necessarily mean it's going to go away 100%. We mean progress, experiencing more of the fullness and wholeness of Jesus in and through us. So we want to see progress, not necessarily perfection yet. We long for that one day. So assumption number one is people think that depression is the same for everyone. But in reality, it's super, super complicated. In the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, this is the Bible of psychiatry, there's a whole section on depressive disorders, and there's 8 of them in total. So one of them is major depressive disorder, and this is the one that most people are referring to when they talk about depression. And so the hard thing about this is if you polled 10 people who all were clinically diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you would get 10 different pictures of what this depression looks like. There was one author who they did a large amount of research from the time of Hippocrates to modern times in the early 2000s, and they were looking for a single one-word definition of depression, and they couldn't find it. Instead, they saw a lot of metaphorical language where people throughout history have described it as this weight, this heavy weight, or this state of darkness. And so it's really hard to pinpoint what depression is. And there's so many different variations of depression, and depression can be a symptom of other problems too. It's very, very complicated. And then on top of that, you've got a large number of people that may not have clinical depression. They may not meet the qualities of that, but they struggle with this subclinical depression where they are feeling some of the elements and symptoms of it. And that is just as serious, and we need to tend to that too. So it's very complicated, and a lot of people carry from that this other assumption that depressed people must be sad. And we just think sadness is the defining feature of depression. And it can be, it's one of them, but it doesn't necessarily have to present like that. In the DSM, this is what it says for major depressive disorder, that you have to have 5 or more of the following symptoms. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they have to be present during the same 2-week period. So they would say that these symptoms have to be present almost every day, most of the day, for at least 2 weeks. And it has to represent a change from previous functioning, with at least one of the symptoms being a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. Now, when we hear depressed mood, we typically think sadness, but it can also be this feeling of emptiness or hopelessness, and especially in teenagers, it can present as irritability. And so if you're a teenager or you're a parent of a teenager, it doesn't mean you have depression if you're irritable. It just means it is one way that it can present in people is irritability or hopelessness or angst or emptiness. And it could, of course, be sadness. But I've talked to a number of people who said, I wasn't sad. I was just kind of feeling empty, or I didn't have interest in everything. I was just kind of numb and floating through life. And it's like, well, that can still qualify as depression. So a helpful mnemonic to remember those symptoms, one of them being depressed mood that's not in here, is SIG-E CAPS. This is in your notes. This is just a helpful thing to remember. The S is sleep changes. I is your interest declines. The G is you have an excessive amount of guilt. This isn't just I feel bad about something. It's internalized guilt. There's something wrong with me. I'm feeling useless. I have a problem. Energy levels tend to be lower. Concentration difficulties are present. You've got appetite or weight fluctuations. You have psychomotor changes, so you might see people pacing more or feeling more busy or doing things with their hands, or they might be slowed down and their facial expressions might not match the emotion that is on the outside. Something happy's going on and they're just, kind of flat and just slow to talk. That can be a sign. And then suicidal ideation. This can be active. This can be the person who says, I'm actively making plans to harm myself and I have all the details figured out. Or it could be passive, where it's someone saying, I wouldn't necessarily do anything to stop it, and I'm having recurring thoughts about death or dying. It can be either one of those. So to be clinically diagnosed, you need at least 5 of those 9, and they have to present for at least 2 weeks, most days, and almost all the time during the day. That's kind of the clinical definition. Now, what's super interesting is when you look at the research across the globe, you find that these symptoms that we see in the West that we classify as depression are not always present in other cultures. Instead, other cultures have a lot of somatic complaints. That means their symptoms are coming out in their body. It may be stomach aches, it may be physical illnesses, it may be headaches, different things like that. They're not seeing all of the psychological symptoms that we see, and yet it's still what their culture would consider depression. And to me, that's really, really interesting, because when I read the Bible, there have been times where I thought, okay, if depression is a reality, and I think it is, then why don't we see the explicit language used more often? And this tells me, oh, what if it's because the Bible was written in a different culture with different ideological beliefs and different ways of looking at things and processing things, and what if their depression was coming out in different symptoms than we see in the West? And when you read the Bible closely, you see them frequently talking about despair, talking about just wanting to die and not wanting to be alive anymore. You see him talking about excessive guilt and hopelessness. You see him talking about physical pain. And so to me, it's like, okay, the Bible does normalize this sense that we call depression. And you have to look closely, but I think our first application as a church as a whole to build a culture in tackling this beast of depression is we've got to start normalizing it. And I don't mean that we say, okay, you're depressed and you're sitting in it and you're not doing anything about it and we're just going to kind of say, oh, that's normal, that's fine, and we're going to walk away from you. I don't mean that. I mean normalize it as in we need to talk about it and let people know that this is a common reality that we face currently and throughout history. We need to make people feel like they're not crazy, there's not something wrong with them, that this doesn't necessarily have to even last their entire life. We can normalize it and give them a little bit of hope. And I'm going to read Psalm 88. I'm going to read it in its entirety, and it's really easy to zone out when we read long blocks here, but even if you have to close your eyes, try to tap into the emotions of this psalm. This is considered perhaps the darkest psalm in the Bible, and it's the one that has really the least amount of hope, and I'm so glad it's recorded for us because it addresses the realities of someone that was deep in the midst of a long period of suffering. So try to tap into those emotions. The title says, For the Choir Director, a psalm of the descendants of Korah, a song to be sung to the tune, The Suffering of Affliction, a psalm of Herman the Ezrahite. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out to you by day. I come to you at night. Now hear my prayer and listen to my cry, for my life is full of troubles and death draws near. I am as good as dead, like a strong man with no strength left. They have left me among the dead, and I lie like a corpse in a grave. I am forgotten, cut off from your care. You've thrown me into the lowest pit, into the darkest depths. Your anger weighs me down. With wave after wave, you have engulfed me. You've driven my friends away by making me repulsive to them. I am in a trap with no way of escape. My eyes are blinded by my tears. Each day I beg for your help, O Lord. I lift my hands to you for mercy. Are your wonderful deeds of any use to the dead? Do the dead rise up and praise you? Can those in the grave declare your unfailing love? Can they proclaim the faithfulness in the place of destruction? Can the darkness speak of your wonderful deeds? Can anyone in the land of forgetfulness talk about your righteousness? O Lord, I cry out to you. I will keep on pleading day by day. O Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you turn your face from me? I have been sick and close to death since my youth. I stand helpless and desperate before your terrors. Your fierce anger has overwhelmed me. Your terrors have paralyzed me. They swirl around me like floodwaters all day long. They have engulfed me completely. You've taken away my companions and loved ones. Darkness is my closest friend. Imagine someone praying that in your life group. Like, you'd be sitting there like, jeez, like, what's wrong with this person? They're blaming God. Like, they're that mad at him. They're hurting that much that they're blaming God. But what these kinds of psalms did in the Bible is they normalized this deep feeling of suffering and affliction. And by normalizing realities of things like depression, I truly believe we start to rob it of some of its power it has over us. And I love this psalm because when you look closely at it, you see how he's talking about there's all kinds of factors that are coming together here. He's talking about how complicated life is, on how he was sick and close to death even as a child, and there's all these stressors on the outside and internal distress and problems with his spirituality, and he feels like God's not listening to his prayers, and he's even angry at God, and it's all coming together, and it points us to assumption 3 that we make about depression, and that's that we assume that depression has a singular cause, when in reality it doesn't. The Mass Gen Comprehensive Clinical Psychiatry textbook, it's thousands of pages long, it's a standard in the field, it was revised in, I think it was 2018, so this is relatively up to date. In the entire book, there's one sentence on the origin of major depression. You want to know what it says? It says, the pathophysiology, which is the origin, of major depressive disorder remains largely unknown. It's like, I don't know. We know a lot in neuroscience and psychology, but this we don't really know. And I appreciate it because they're being honest. And I think pop psychology and pop culture, it's fed us this lie that there's always one singular cause of depression, but there's not. It's usually a complicated mixture of many factors intermingling, and it's hard to parse out which came first and which other ones are symptoms of it. So there's a really helpful framework that has been used in psychology to be able to assess different problems in life, and it's called the biopsychosocial spiritual framework. And what it does is it says, what are some biological causes to this? What are some psychological causes? What are some social causes? And what are some spiritual causes? And so when you take that and you apply it to depression, we could start with the biological and the psychological. What we get is one, we know there are biological mechanisms at work when it comes to depression. Now, the problem is we don't know what the particular mechanisms are. There's all kinds of theories. There's people that say you've got different molecules in your brain that promotes growth and health, and those molecules are not doing what they should do, and so your brain is not, your neurons really are not growing, they're not surviving, they're not differentiating, and so that may cause depression. There's some people that say different parts of your brain, like the parts that control memory or emotional processing, in people who have depression are actually smaller. They're shrunk a little bit compared to someone who doesn't have major depression. And that could be caused from genetic factors, but it could also be caused by stress. We know that cortisol and adrenaline, these stress hormones, in excessive amounts, they can shrink parts of your brain. Like, that's been proven again and again. The most popular theory is the chemical imbalance theory. Perhaps you've heard of it. It says that you have chemicals in your brain. They're called neurotransmitters. And normally you have them kind of working in this set range to promote optimal health. But for people who have depression, they say these chemicals tend to be lowered. And so what you need is medication to get them up to their standard range so you can start to feel a little better. So I want to say this cautiously and with compassion, but these are just theories. And every one of them has some major, major red flags with them. And I don't know if I buy into them totally. Now, I truly believe there's something biologically going on. We see it but depression tends to pass down through families. Like, there's got to be something going on, but I don't think it's the whole picture. And I want to say that because people who buy into a strictly biological cause of depression tend to walk away believing, well, my only hope is medication. My only hope is to change that biology inside my brain. And a lot of people get stuck because they lose hope, they lose motivation, and especially when the medication doesn't work, they think, well, maybe I'm the problem. There must just be something wrong with me. And in reality, the low effectiveness rates of medication has led a lot of clinicians to say maybe there's something more going on here besides the biological factors. Now, if medication has worked for you, awesome. I am truly happy. Okay, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it shows a lack of faith. I'm just saying there's a lot of research out there that says we don't really know why it works for some people, why it doesn't work for others. But it's led people on this quest to say, well, there's got to be some kind of other factors that might contribute to or cause depression. And so people have looked at stress, even good stress, like the kind of stress you feel when you're really busy and you're trying to be really productive and you're working a hard job that requires a lot from you, or in your stage of life that requires a lot for you, and it's just go, 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 and you're not sleeping a lot, you're not eating a lot, but you're feeling like that rush, like I love this, I'm doing what I love. Even that good kind of stress can do damage to your body. We found that depression tends to spike when people go through different transitions in stages of life, so from single to married, or married to unmarried, or married to with kids, or kids to an empty nester. Like we tend to see rates of depression spike during those transitional periods, and we see it spike when people go through stressful life events. Trauma is a major predictor of depression. Unresolved grief, low self-esteem, negative self-talk, faulty mental rules. If you believe if X happens to me, it must mean Y, and there's no other thing about it, it's just true, that can contribute to depression. Difficulty naming and processing emotion, all of these psychological factors can trigger depression, but what's frustrating is they can all also be a result of depression. So people sit around all day and they argue, well, which came first? Was it the biology, the psychology? Do they intermingle? And how do we parse this out? It's really, really complicated. In the DSM, even says, it goes as far to say, it makes me angry. Essentially, all major non-mood disorders, so anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, trauma disorders, stress disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, even eating and feeding disorders, increase the risk of an individual developing depression. It's like, okay, so we don't know. We truly don't know. And it can be a little alarming. It can be a little concerning. And we think, where does this leave us? I think it leaves us at our next application, which is one of the things we can do is we can tend the biopsychosocial spiritual roots. We may not know where our struggles are stemming from, but we can begin to dig under the surface and tend the roots, and we can pay attention to every strand and leave no stone unturned in figuring out what is going on inside me. And the Bible does this, I think. The Bible affirms the importance of our physical existence, of our bodies. It affirms the importance of getting a proper amount of rest and pleasure and nutrition and being outdoors and doing things that are productive and working with our body. We think of Jesus, who prioritized resting and pulling away from the crowds during active ministry periods, and he was taking care of himself and resting in the Father. When Elijah was suicidal and he was being chased down, he was saying, I want to die. I don't want to be alive. I want you to kill me, God. And an angel came and touched him compassionately and said, eat, sleep. And then he slept and he ate and he woke up, and the angel said, eat, sleep again. And he did it again, and then he said, okay, now you're sustained to be able to go. You think of Job, who Job wanted to die because he had so much physical pain. He had these blisters that were bursting all over his body, and he said, it's so painful, I just want to die. And so the Bible, to me, it affirms that there's this complicated interaction between how our body is feeling and what we're doing with our body and our psychology and our mind, and it also intermingles with different environmental factors and things we've been through and things we've lived through. And I think we see that even in Psalm 88. We see that unique interplay where all of these factors start to come together. So we need to take care of our bodies, we need to take care of our minds and pay attention to what is going on inside of us, the specifics of what is going on inside of us. This is Psalm 42. This is a great example of someone writing a psalm, paying attention to what's going on within them. And the psalm starts out, as the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, the living God. When can I go and stand before him? And for most of my life, I heard this psalm, and it was said in a positive sentiment. It was like, I want to be like the deer, panting for God. Oh, I want God or water, God, so I want you. Like I just want to be that deer. But I want to reframe this a little and suggest that the deer is miserable. The deer is dying. Perhaps the deer is being hunted, dehydrated, longing for survival, and using that as a metaphor for just like I'm dying physically here, so I feel like I'm dying spiritually. I feel like you're abandoning me, God. And read in that light, it's like, ooh, that's different. He goes on, he says, day and night I have only tears for food, while my enemies continually taunt me, saying, where is this God of yours? My heart is breaking as I remember how it used to be. I walked among the crowds of worshipers, leading a great procession to the house of God, singing for joy and giving thanks amid the sounds of a great celebration. And then he does this. He says, why am I so discouraged? Why is my heart so sad? I will put my hope in God. I will praise him again, my Savior and my God. Now I am deeply discouraged, but I will remember you. And he goes on later in the psalm, he says the same thing. Why am I down? What is going on inside of me? So he notices what's inside, and he doesn't just stuff it away. He doesn't lie about it. He acknowledges it. He notices the specificity of how he's feeling and what he's thinking and how it compares to what used to be going on in his life. And then he says, okay, God, this is my reality. This is how I feel. This is where I'm at right now. And he vividly describes it to God, but he commits to praising God even in the midst of it. And then he's talking to himself. He's feeding himself the truths and the promises of God. Why is my heart so discouraged? Hope in him. Remember him. Remember what he did. And if you read the whole psalm, he goes on, he talks about some things that God has done, and it's so hopeful. For me, this was a moment in my life when I've always prayed in my head and out loud in group settings, but I never had prayed out loud when I was alone. And I remember vividly, I was in a car driving to the Broadway building down the hill on New Bittinger, and I don't remember what I was feeling, what was going on, but I was not in a good mood, and I had this thought, just pray out loud. Just say the promises of God out loud. Speak it out. And immediately I'm like, that is so stupid. Like, I'm talking to myself. I already feel embarrassed for someone that might see me. And so I'm like wrestling in my head. Maybe you've done that back and forth. And I just went for it. I just started praying out loud. I don't even remember what I said. I don't remember the content. But I remember there was a powerful impact of saying out loud the truths of God to my own spirit. And of saying, I'm not feeling it right now. I'm having a hard time believing it right now, but just being honest and saying it. That's the kind of thing here where I think psychologically we have weapons to be able to pull God in. I mean, the Spirit of God lives within us. Like, we can tap into that and say, all right, it's not just positive self-talk. I'm cool, I'm great, everything's going to be all right. I mean, you can do that, that's fine, but we have the tool of being able to pull God into, what does God say about me? What are the truths of the gospel? How can I remember that God is good even in this? How can I convince myself? My clinical supervisor in my therapy program, he would tell me, he constantly told clients, he'd be like, you got to outfox the fox. Like, you got to outwit yourself. You know, you got to convince yourself that the way you're seeing it now is not always the full picture. It's not always reality. You got to outfox the fox. I just love that. It's so funny. So those factors have been, talked about in the literature, the biological and the psychological. The next factors have been a little less talked about, but it's the ones that I've had the most experience with in my training. As a marriage and family therapist, we're trained in something called systems theory. And all this means is we tend to back up a little bit and say, let's get the bigger picture. Let's not just pay attention to you as an individual, but let's see how you fit in to your context and how your context impacts you. And of course, we want to pay attention to the system, how our brains and our bodies interact. That's a system. But then therapists came along and they said, your family is a system, and all the relationships you're part of, they form a system. And when you do one thing, it causes another family to do another thing, which causes another family to do another thing. And we all kind of have this little dance that we organize around. And so what this theory did is it presented a theory of depression, saying, what if people's depression is actually a cause of relational trauma? In my internship and in the people I've worked with, this is overwhelmingly one of the primary causes, in my view, of depression. And it's relational trauma, relational brokenness, dysfunction, abuse, betrayal, feeling like I don't belong, constant invalidation. I don't have anyone to turn to. Like, these things have a way of breaking us. They cause us to feel like nobody's in our corner, nobody cares for us, and then we start to go down the rabbit trail of, well, maybe something's wrong with me, maybe I'm the problem, that's why nobody likes me. And so it was a really fascinating theory, and then a guy named Yuri Bronfenbrenner, he came along and he said, it's bigger than that. He said, your body is a system and it interacts with itself. You're in a family system that interacts, but your family also interacts with other families, and those families interact with the culture and the cultural beliefs and ideology, and the culture changes over time. And so he came up with what he called the ecological systems theory, and he focused heavily on the macro system, this idea that the cultural values of your generation can shape your perceptions of mental illness. And no one had ever studied this and applied it to depression. And here's a picture of how I think culture and time shape our perceptions of depression. This is a true story right here. This part is, in June of 1917, in the midst of World War I, the British General Staff issued a general routine order that stated, get over here, in no circumstances whatsoever will the expression shell shock be used verbally or be recorded in any regimental or any casualty report or in any hospital or other medical document. And instead, all soldiers with psychiatric problems were to be given a single diagnosis of NYDN, which stood for not yet diagnosed nervous. That's awful. And what was happening is, in the midst of World War I, research was coming out saying war trauma is real. We're calling it shell shock. We're seeing physiological effects of soldiers in the war, but countries didn't like that. Germans especially, they were saying it's a character flaw. It's a deficit If you're not willing to fight in the war and you can't handle it, you need to get out because something's wrong with you. And so even governments were coming together saying, we're going to ban books talking about war trauma. Medical journals were saying any research on this is going to be halted. We're not going to publish it. This is what was going on in the culture. It was denying the reality of trauma. And so picture with me then a grandfather who was in the war, and this is what was going on. He was traumatized, but it was repressed, it was invalidated, it was denied. And so instead of being able to process it and work with it, it came out as intense rage and anger towards everyone and everything. Rightly so, because he's been hurt. He's been invalidated. So then he's in a family with all this anger, and him and his wife, they have children, and the parenting is not warm in this family. He's very harsh towards the children, and they're not allowed to talk of any psychological problems. And so this child grows up thinking, okay, there's something wrong with me. And as she ages, she starts to complain of stomach aches and headaches, and she's having all these physical health problems, and they won't see any kind of psychological doctor. They're just talking to people focusing on the biology. And so she's going about her life, and then through no fault of her own, she's sexually abused for a long period of time. She tells her family about it, and they say, we don't believe you. People don't do that. That's not a thing. You're making this up because you want attention. So things spiral. She's now got even more symptoms of her body. Just her health is really messed up. But she kind of moves away from that family, and she finds a man. She marries him, and the marriage is pretty good overall. She's kind of regaining some of her self-esteem, and she's talking with her husband about everything that's happened in her life, and she's blaming God. She's saying, this is the lot that was handed to me. You know, they're talking about having kids. Should they go to church? She's like, no, I will not go. I will not worship any God that did this to me. He can't be good. It was all a lie fed to me. And so then they have another child, and the child is born prematurely they're concerned about neurological issues. But, you know, child's born, child grows, everything seems fine, and they're like, okay, this is good. And then at this point, the culture's different. People are talking about depression now. People are talking about trauma. And then when the child's about 12 years old, right around the same time that the mom was abused, she starts to get very irritable, just unusually irritable. But the parents are like, well, adolescence, you know, what are you going to do? It's just pre-teenage hormones, and we'll just kind of deal with it, and we'll try to be nice to her, try to keep the peace. But then she starts pulling out of different school activities. She's not connecting with her family as much. She's pulling away from different friends. She's just acting really low around the house. And so she sees a school counselor, and the counselor says, have you thought about depression? You know, everything you're describing to me, it kind of fits this label. And for the first time, she's like, oh my gosh, this is right. This must be my reality. It makes so much sense. So she goes home and she tells her parents, and they're like, that's ridiculous. Nobody in our family has struggled with depression. And her grandparents says, you're being a baby about this. Like, we've all dealt with our stuff. Why can't you just grow up and deal with it? Now, here's the question. What caused her depression? Do you get that? Like, how complicated this is. All of these factors throughout history and changing cultural viewpoints really shape our perceptions on what depression is, how it manifests, what we can or should do about it. You know, it's a big deal. And so when we think about our social roots and our family history and what we can do about this, I truly think awareness is really critical. And I want to plug this emotionally healthy discipleship catalyst that we have. It's going to be launching this coming week. This is a great opportunity to start to dig into some of your own family history. You'll be equipped with tools like the genogram, where you trace your family history 3 generations back, and you look at attitudes and different things that may have passed down through the generations, both good and not so good. You'll learn a tool called incarnational listening, where you figure just as Jesus entered into our world in the incarnation, so we can enter into other people's worlds and listen to them and validate them. And it's a great tool, especially if you're not suffering with depression, to see the complexity of other people's sufferings and to be able to listen to them and love them. And then you think about our spiritual factors. And this is, raise your hand if you've heard someone say something like, you're depressed because you don't pray enough, or you don't have enough faith, or something, you know, you must be sinning. Has anyone heard a good number? And I think, unfortunately, that is often the reality of how spiritual leaders and church leaders approach this topic, is they don't really know what to say about it, so we just say, well, what's going on spiritually? Now, the hard thing about this is there truly probably is a lot going on spiritually. Spirituality is such a major cause of depression, and I've thought, even in my own life, in times when I've been suffering and I've been going through extended periods of hardship, when people would talk about, well, what's your spiritual disciplines like? What are your Bible reading habits? It's like I would almost get defensive and angry, like, oh, you think that's what it is? And I'd kind of come across attacking them, but then I'd walk away thinking, yeah, actually, I'm not doing that very much. I'm not praying. I'm not living in the reality that this is spiritual warfare and I'm under attack. I'm not paying attention to my prayer life. I'm not engaging in stillness and silence. I'm not doing the things that I know I need to do to be able to hear and meet Jesus in the midst of my suffering. But I think our culture has almost made it so taboo to even suggest that your depression might be caused from something spiritual that we kind of tend to downplay it and ignore it. And so I'm just trying to compassionately suggest that this is one of those major factors that may be contributing to your depression. And if you're sitting there saying, actually, I'm seeking God, I'm seeking Him as much as I can, I don't think that's it for me right now, then that's fine. Maybe there's other things going on. But Carl Jung was a psychiatrist back in the day, and he was famous. There was this case where a man with alcoholism came to him for treatment, and he said to him, you realize this is a spiritual problem, right? Now, this guy was not a follower of Jesus, but he was truly onto something. He understood that spiritual realities permeate all of our problems. And for some of us, tending our spiritual roots are going to be key to experiencing any sense of overcoming depression. So how do we do that? What do? We could say a lot about it, but there's 2 key points I want to make. 1, to tend the spiritual roots, we need to learn the art of lament. Lament is a biblical form of prayer where we express our pain and our brokenness to God. We tell Him that we're confused, that we're hurting, that we're angry even, and we cry out to Him, still holding on to hope that He will and can act, but we're being very forthright with our feelings. Here's an example, Psalm 77. I cry out to God, yes, I shout, oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long, I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for His help. This is someone who is acknowledging the validity of their experience, and yet they're saying, God is not answering my prayers. I'm in a lot of pain, and it doesn't seem like it's working. But he goes on in the psalm and other places, we don't have time to go into it, but he goes on and he affirms his trust and his confidence in God, that God can act. He can decisively change this man's situation at any given point. And so he will keep seeking God. And the idea is that even though he's lamenting, it's a lament of faith. And lamenting takes great faith to be able to do. When you're on the verge of giving up, when you want to throw in the towel, when you want to quit, and the last thing you want to do is pray, it takes great faith and boldness to be able to pray. And for those of you who don't struggle with depression, it's really important to know that for some, it is required more faith to do less than you do. It requires more faith for some people to just get out of bed, pray boldly to God, seek Him, go to work, and come home, take care of themselves, than it does for you to maybe do a lot, especially when they're in an extended period of suffering. Lamenting is an act of faith. It's an act of praise. When Kelsey was talking about praise being the weapon against our enemy, lament is a form of praise. And we cry out to God, begging Him to change our situation. We plead the promises of God, was one author's view of lament, is we're pleading God's promises. We're calling out to Him, saying, why? How long? How much longer is this going to happen? But I trust You. I'm not going to sit in it. I'm going to put my faith in You. I'm going to believe that You can change this, even if it's not how I feel right now. And it's hard for us to do that. It's hard for us, even as a church, to create the space needed for lament. But I think the church should be the safest place in the world. the safest place for us to bring all of our struggles and all of our sufferings, and to be met with compassion and mercy, and people saying, let's turn to the Lord. Let's seek him together. Let's not make assumptions. Let's chase after God together. So as a church, we must learn to lament. We also must learn to embrace a theology of weakness. And I'm going to explain this as the band comes up. And I want to be sensitive here because I've talked to a couple people. I couldn't find better language for this. What I'm not saying that your depression makes you weak. What I am saying is the Bible advocates for this idea that God's power is made known in and through our weakness. Whether we're struggling with a mental health problem or a physical health problem or a personality trait or a broken relationship or a life transition that's hard or stress or an extended season of suffering, whatever is causing us to feel the pain and the vulnerability and the limp, God wants to meet us in the midst of that. And Paul said he prayed that God would take away a thorn in his flesh. He calls it a messenger from Satan, like the enemy was targeting him to take him out. And he prayed that God would take it away. And God said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. And I think we live in a culture that values strength, and we say strength comes through authority and hard work and money and success and production. And I'm saying it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Strength and power come in and through embracing and living out of our weaknesses. And I want to be part of a church movement that says we live and lead from a place of weakness and vulnerability. Not believing that we are fundamentally flawed and weak and we should be ashamed and, there's something so wrong with us that we have no value. No, we have immense value as children of God. We are made in the image of God. But that image has been fractured, like I said a couple weeks ago. We struggle and we hurt. So our big idea is depression is real and hope is possible. And I hope you guys will join me on this journey to embrace and live out of vulnerability